He woke up sweating cold that morning, with his heart pounding. The voice in his head repeated the same sentence. The blood still runs in the shadows of the temple. In the distance, a bell rang 3 times. It was the warning that something terrible was about to happen, and he knew there was no turning back. I always thought that stories about Mormon rituals and secrets were things from movies or exaggerated conspiracy theories, until I spent a few days in a small town in the countryside of Utah. I won't say the name of the city, because honestly I'm still afraid to talk about it. I was there because of a temporary job, a mix of curiosity and need for money. The city was surrounded by mountains with a somewhat stagnant air and time, and had a close-knit Mormon community. Despite this, some people were friendly, and soon made friends with a guy named Ethan, who had left the religion a few years ago. He looked a little bitter, but still knew much about the church's costumes, including the ancient temple that stood high on a hill. He told me, in a low tone as if someone could hear, that the place had been abandoned for years, but that sometimes they were seen at night, along with strange children. I thought he was playing with me or intimidating me, but he was serious. "If you really want to know, go there at night," he said. I should have ignored it, but my curiosity got the better of me. The next night, I decided to take a look. I had an old truck and drove to the beginning of the trail that led to the temple. It was a steep and half-neglected climb, surrounded by tall trees that made everything seem even darker than it already was. The only light came from my lantern, and the wind whistled through the trees in a way that made the spine freeze. The temple finally appeared before me, and my heart exploded. It was a big building, with those typical towers and heavy wooden doors that were there for centuries. The golden plates in front were stained by time, but still reflected some moonlight. There was no sign of anyone, but when I started to approach, I had a strange feeling of being watched. I can't explain, but the air seemed denser, as if something was waiting for me inside. The entrance of the temple was half open, which already seemed strange to me. I expected it to be locked, considering the place looked abandoned, but the door creaked when I pushed it, as if someone had just used it. Inside, everything was even more sinister. The air was stuffy, heavy, and there was a strange smell, like a mixture of old dust and something metallic. My lantern lit up stone walls decorated with Mormon symbols that I vaguely recognized because of Ethan, but there were others I had never seen before, more intricate, almost like inscriptions from another language. As I walked down the main hall, I heard a distant sound. It was a low, constant hum coming from somewhere deeper in the temple. With each step, it seemed that the sound became louder, as if something wanted me to move on. Part of me wanted to turn and run to the car, but again, a curiosity kept me there. When I arrived at a kind of central hall, my instincts began to scream. The place was poorly lit, but my flashlight picked up something on the ground. It was a circle, carefully drawn with symbols that were made of melted wax. In the center, there was what I initially thought to be a cloak or pile of cloth. When I approached, I realized that it was nothing like that. It was animal skin cut and getting laid out. There was no one there, but the smell was almost unbearable, like burnt flesh. That's when I noticed the marks on the walls around the hall. They were deep, but they were too deep to be made by human hands or normal aids. Not only that, In some parts, it seemed that the wall material was corroded, as if something acidic had been poured there. The feeling of being handed back strongly, but now it was more than that. It seemed something was close. Very close. As I tried to process what I was selling, I heard something that made my heart almost stop. It was the sound of footsteps coming from the corridor where I had entered. It was not hasty steps, but firm and deliberate, as if someone were walking with a purpose. I froze in place, holding the flashlight with enough force to make my fingers hurt. I called, half stammering, wondering if there was someone there. My voice echoed in the hall, but no one answered. The steps stopped suddenly, and everything became absurdly silent, as if the sound had been sucked out of the environment. Then came a suggestion. It was low, almost inaudible, but seemed to come from all sides at once. It wasn't in English. It wasn't in any language I knew. It seemed something guttural, almost animal, but with a cadence that suggested words. The tinnitus from before came back, but now it seemed to be confused with the whisper, creating a kind of vibration that I could feel in my chest. At that moment, I decided I had crossed the line. I started to move towards the exit, trying not to make any noise. But before I could reach the door, something happened that made me question everything. The old golden plates that were on the floor of the hall, I had noticed some scattered, like pieces fallen from some decoration, appear to shine, very light, as if an internal light was lighting in them. At the same time, I feel a pressure in the air, as if the environment is closing around me. The brightness became more intense, and then I saw something that still gives me chills to remember. What looked like blood began to flow from the edges of these plates slowly, as if it was emerging from the metal itself. The blood formed lines that ran to the center of the circle on the ground, joining the melted wax. It was not possible that it was real, but I was seeing and smelling the metallic smell of fresh blood. I can't move. My body was paralyzed, as if something was holding me in place. The paralysis was abruptly broken when a loud, dry sound, like a door slamming, echoed through the temple. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but it seemed like the noise wasn't coming from a specific place. It was just everywhere. Instinctively, I turned to the entrance, but it was completely dark, as if the moonlight illuminated the outside that had disappeared. My heart was beating so hard that I could hear it in my ears, and the buzzing, now more intense, seemed to vibrate in my bones. It was then that I realized I was no longer alone. At the edge of the circle of symbols, there was a shadow. It wasn't a person, it was something, tall and slender, with contours that do not stop flickering like the smoke of an extinguished candle. No face, but even so I knew he was looking directly at me. Without thinking, I pointed the lantern at the thing, but the light seemed to be swallowed by its outline. It did not illuminate, just disappeared as if absorbed. I felt an unbearable pressure in my head, as if something was trying to enter my mind, search my thoughts. My instinct cried out for me to get out of there, but my sincere feet stuck to the ground, as if the air around me had solidified. It was then that the shadow began to move. Slowly, almost as if floating, it crossed the circle and stopped a few meters from me. The only thing I could do was to close my eyes and pray that it would end. I didn't know what to believe, but at that moment, everything worked. After a few seconds that seemed like hours, the sound stopped. When I opened my eyes, the hall was empty. The shadow had disappeared, and the blood on the golden plates too. But the smell was still there, and the feeling that something had touched me in a way I could never understand. Still in shock, I started walking towards the exit, my legs shaking and my heart pounding. Each step seemed a monumental effort. The silence of the temple was even more suffocating than before. The only thing I could hear was the irregular sound of my own breathing. When I finally reached the door, something stopped me. They were on the inside, like deep marks that weren't there when I came in. Don't know why, but I reached out to touch one of the marks, and the wall was absurdly cold, as if it had been left in a freezer for days. It was different from the rest of the temple, which had a muffled heat. I took my hand away quickly, with an almost primitive instinct that I should not touch it. But when I looked at my hand, there was a dark spot, almost black. No blood. It was not dust. It was something that didn't make sense, and honestly I didn't figure out what it was. Get out of there as fast as I could. I didn't look back as I walked down the road to the truck, but the feeling of being present never went away. When I got to the vehicle, my hands were shaking so much that it took me a few minutes to get the key in the ignition. As soon as the engine was on, I accelerated as fast as I could to get out of that place. The brake lasted a while. As I drove down the deserted road, I saw something in my eye corner. In the rear view mirror, for a fraction of a second, I swear that I saw the same shadow standing in the middle of the road, as if it was watching me go away. Didn't look again. Didn't want to confirm. I just kept driving and didn't stop until I got back to town. When I finally got into the small motel where I was staying, I locked the door, closed the curtains, and fell on the floor, trying to understand what had happened. But the more I thought, the less sense it made. After that night, I decided not to tell anyone what had happened. Ethan casually told me the next day if I had the courage to go to the temple, but I lied, saying that I was not even close. He laughed and commented something about better this way. During the following days, I became paranoid. Any noise in the motel made me jump, and the feeling of being watched continued. I didn't see the shadow anymore, but I never felt completely alone either. Before leaving the city, I decided to take a last drive around the streets, trying to convince myself that what happened was the fruit of my imagination. It was then that I saw something that made me speed back to the highway without looking back. In the community mural of the city, where they used to put notices and local events, there was a newly clipped brochure. It was an invitation to a special meeting in the temple. No details, just the date and a small print phrase. Come and get what has been promised. The data was that same night. Even now, months later, when I try to put my thoughts in order, nothing makes sense. I researched the temple, the city, anything that could give me an explanation, but all I found were vague stories and local legends. There are no official records that anything strange happened there, but neither is there any mention of what the temple was before it was abandoned. Ethan, or anyone else in town, never answered me. They seem to have disappeared. Since I came back, I still dream about it. The hall, the symbols, the blood, and the shadow. Always the shadow. I don't tell them because I want someone to believe me. I'm telling you because I don't want to carry it myself. I know some people will laugh, say it's an invention or exaggeration. That's fine. I just need someone to know because until today, I feel that it is not over. And if you ever pass through that city, please do not go up to the temple. Background. Always thought that these stories about small towns that had dark secrets were exaggerations or people wanting attention. That is until I spend a few days in a small town in the countryside, which I prefer not to mention by name just in case. I was there to visit a childhood friend who had moved away years ago. The city had that typical interior mood: quiet streets, old houses, and a feeling that nothing really important was happening there. But I soon realized something was wrong. On my first night, while we were sitting on my friend's balcony, I heard something strange in the air. It was almost imperceptible, like a distant murmur mixed with a melody you can't identify. I asked my friend if he heard that too, but he just changed the subject and started talking about something else, in a way that made me realize that he wanted to avoid a conversation. That's when I got a flea in my ear. The next day, I explored the city alone while my friend worked. I talked to some people in the market and in the central square, trying to look casual. I talked about the place, about the history of the city, but every time I mentioned anything about what I had heard the night before, I asked the uncomfortable people. An older man even said and left without saying a word when I mentioned the whispers. Later, a gentleman who was sitting on a wooden bench near the church called me discreetly. He spoke fast, almost whispering, telling me not to ask too many questions, and especially to avoid the old community center, a red brick building on the north side of town. He posted something about what's underneath and walked away before I could ask more. At that moment, I found out he was just another superstitious old man in town, but at night things really changed. That night, the murmurs were louder, and this time directed to come from a specific direction. Even with the windows closed, I could clearly hear something that seemed a strange melody, but without instruments, only voices. My friend was not at home, had gone out for an appointment, so I decided to investigate on my own. I took a flashlight and followed the sound. It was almost mesmerizing, as if calling me, but at the same time, every step I took made me more nervous. The sound led me to the community center that the old man had indicated earlier. From close up, the building looked much older than I had noticed during the day. Cracked bricks, dirty windows, and a nearly illegible sign with the name of the place. The outside lights were out, and everything was shrouded in heavy darkness except for the faint light coming from a window in the basement. For a moment, I thought about going back. Something was wrong there, very wrong. But a curiosity, or perhaps something else, pushed me to continue. I went to the side of the building, where I found a metal door partially open, as if someone had forgotten to close it. Upon entering, the smell of moisture and mold hit me like a wall. But there was another smell as well, something metallic and seasick that I could not identify at the time. I went down the steps, squeaking and creeping to the basement where the dim light partially illuminated the space. Downstairs, the sound was louder. It was no longer just a murmur. It was a kind of singing in unison, rhythmic, but without words I could understand. When I turned the last corner of the corridor, my lantern lit something that made my blood cold. A group of people, all wearing dark clothes and hooded, surrounded a symbol on the floor, drawn with what seemed to be blood. For a moment, I was completely still. I didn't know whether to try to get out of there in silence or hide to observe more. The group seemed totally focused on what they were doing, as if nothing else around mattered. The voices continued in a low, rhythmic tone, almost hypnotic, and I noticed that the symbol on the floor seemed to shine in a subtle way, as if the light of the room was moving with it. I began to notice details that only made everything more disturbing. Some of the hoods were stained, and the metallic smell I felt before was stronger there, as if the blood was fresh. The feeling that I was in a place where I should not be taking care of myself, but my legs obviously locked. As I tried to slowly back up, something happened that stopped time. One of the people in the circle suddenly mentioned the head, and even under the hoods, I felt she was looking straight at me. Don't know how, but at that moment my body finally reacted. Turned off the flashlight and threw myself against the nearest wall, trying to hide in the darkness of the corridor. My heart was racing, and I could barely breathe without fear that the sound would give me away. The voices stopped abruptly, and the silence that grew worse. I heard footsteps. Slowly, one by one, they began to approach the corridor where I was. With each sound of a boot touching the concrete floor, my panic increased. They were looking for me, I was sure. I looked around desperately, trying to find a way out or somewhere to hide, but the corridor was narrow and without doors. Then I saw a small opening in the wall, like a kind of maintenance closet. Without thinking, I sneak inside, closing the door as quietly as possible. All I could do was pray that he would not find me. Inside that locked closet, I can barely breathe. The space was so small that my back was against the broom handles and damp concrete walls. The sound of the steps was coming closer and closer, echoing through the corridor as if someone was dragging the time on purpose, only to increase the terror. One of the steps stopped right in front of the closet where I was hiding. I could hear the heavy breath of whoever it was, slow and almost rhythmic, as if he wanted to make me feel the weight of his presence. I tried to hold my breath, but it was impossible. My chest went up and down unintentionally, and I knew that if that person decided to open the door, I would be finished. Then something suddenly reduced the silence, a loud, metallic sound coming from the main hall. It was as if someone had dropped something heavy on the ground. Whoever was in the corridor started moving again, now with fast steps back towards where the sound came from. This was my only chance, and I knew it. I waited a few seconds after the steps disappeared, and came out of the closet as quietly as I could. The corridor was now empty, but the voices had been presented in the hall, even more intense and communicated in a tone that seemed furious. My heart was beating so fast I could barely think straight, but my gut told me that I had to get out of there right away. I ran towards the stairs, trying to make as little noise as possible, but it was not enough. When I stepped on the first step, I heard a scream coming from behind me. It was not a human cry. It was something slightly distorted, almost animalistic, that reverberated throughout the basement. My body reacted before my mind, and I ran like never in life, climbing the steps 2 by 2, stumbling but not stopping. I reached the metal door, pushed it with all my strength, and threw myself out into the cold night, breathing deeply as if I had just escaped from a drowning. Inside that locked closet, I can barely breathe. The space was so small that my back was against the broom handles and damp concrete walls. The sound of the steps was coming closer and closer, echoing through the corridor as if someone was dragging the time on purpose, only to increase the terror. One of the steps stopped right in front of the closet where I was hiding. I could hear the heavy breath of whoever it was, slow and almost rhythmic, as if he wanted to make me feel the weight of his presence. I tried to hold my breath, but it was impossible. My chest went up and down unintentionally, and I knew that if that person decided to open the door, I would be finished. Then something suddenly reduced the silence, a loud, metallic sound coming from the main hall. It was as if someone had dropped something heavy on the ground. Whoever was in the corridor started moving again, now with fast steps, back towards where the sound came from. Outside, the fresh air didn't seem to be enough to make me laugh. My hands trembled so much that I could barely hold the lantern, and the sound of my heart still beat muffled anything else. But I didn't have time to recover. When I looked back at the door of the community center, I saw something that froze me to the bone. A figure was standing there, standing on the doorstep. It wasn't like the people I had seen in the basement. It was taller, and the outline of the body looked wrong. The edges of the figure were flickering, as if distorted by the dim light coming from within. I could not see a face, hands, or anything human. The only thing I noticed, even from afar, was the brightness of something in her eyes. They were like two small sparks, but so intense that they seemed to pierce the dark. That thing did not move, just stared at me as I took back steps. Without thinking, I turned and ran towards the main street. My legs hurt, and I felt every muscle in my body scream, but the adrenaline did not let me stop. I did not look back once, afraid of what I might see. When I finally got to my friend's house, I knocked on the door so hard that it looked like I was going to break. He opened, was confused, but I could not explain anything. Just walked in, locked all the doors and windows, and sat on the couch trying to catch my breath. My friend kept looking at me, but did not insist, as if he knew something really serious had happened. That night, I could not sleep. With every sound, with every shadow that I saw through the window, my mind turned to the picture on the door of the community center. The city seemed so quiet, but at the same time I felt that something was still happening, that it had not happened. The next morning, I decided that I would necessarily leave that city as fast as possible. I didn't tell my friend anything. I just made up an excuse about an urgent appointment. He looked at me in a strange way, as if he knew I was thinking, but said nothing. I took my things and drove straight to the highway. All the way, I felt like I was being followed, looking in the rear-view mirror every few minutes, but saw nothing but the empty road. Even so, the feeling of being observed did not leave me. When I finally arrived in the next city, I stopped at a gas station and tried to take a deep breath. The attendant asked me if it was okay, and I just shook my head, unable to answer. While filling the tank, I realized something that made me almost drop the fuel pump. On the windshield of my car, there was a mark like a hand, but it wasn't human. The fingers were too long, and the mark seemed to be burned in the glass, as if something very hot had touched there. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. I don't know who or what was in the basement of that community center, and I prefer not to know. Since then, I have had frequent nightmares. The picture on the door, the corners, the symbol on the floor, all this torments me. Whenever I hear a low-pitched song or sounds that resemble whispers, my body becomes tense, and my mind goes back to that place. I searched the city, the community center, but found nothing concrete. It seems that nobody wants to talk about it, as if the place did not exist. I do not know if anyone has gone through what I went through, but I hope not. If you happen to be reading this and hearing about a city where people mention suggestions or songs at night, just do yourself a favor, don't go. Some things are better when they stay in the dark, away from us. The initial mystery. Getting anonymous leads is not exactly unusual in my job as a freelance journalist, but this one was different. Arrived in a simple envelope, without sender, handed in the door of the building where I live. Inside was a piece of yellowed paper with excerpts from a handwritten diary. The handwriting was irregular, almost desperate, and the words were even more disturbing: sacrifice, blood, prophecy. Between disjointed phrases and stains that could be ink or something else, a line was engraved in my mind: the temple holds secrets that light cannot reveal. Along with the paper, there was a location, a small town in the interior, whose name I had never heard before. It was the kind of thing that could be a catch, but something in that message seemed too real to ignore. Perhaps it was the despair in words, or the simple fact that my curiosity did not leave me alone. After days of researching the city and finding almost nothing but generic information, I decided that the only way to understand what was happening was to go there. I arrived on a Sunday afternoon, driving down secondary roads that would simply lead nowhere. The town was small, with old wooden houses and a central square almost deserted. There was a church in the middle of the road, but what caught my attention was the building next door. A large and imposing temple with blackened stained glass windows and a facade that seemed to have been neglected for decades. I asked at a local cafe about the place, but nobody wanted to talk much. The looks I received were enough to know that I had stepped on a sensitive ground. A waitress, after much insistence, just said, "If I were you, I would not come too close at night." That only increased my determination. That night, I decided to explore the temple on my own. Something in that place called me, as if the answer to the mystery was there, hidden in the shadows. I waited until the city was quiet, when the few lights in the windows found to be out. I parked my car in a side street, far enough away not to attract attention, and followed on foot. The temple looked even more intimidating under the faint moonlight, its dark windows reflecting nothing but emptiness. The main entrance was locked with chains and a heavy padlock, but walking sideways I found a smaller door, almost hidden by grown bushes. It was unlocked. When I push it, a smell of moisture and something metallic will hit me immediately. The air inside was thick, loaded with a silence that seemed alive, as if the place was breathing. The main corridor was narrow and covered with dust, with walls decorated by symbols I did not recognize. My heart was beating fast, and every sound, the creaking of the planks under my feet, the echo of my breath, seemed amplified. At the end of the hall, a deep staircase led to the basement. That's when I heard, not a direct sound, but a murmur, almost imperceptible, that seemed to come from under the earth. It wasn't the kind of sound you expected to hear in an empty building. My curiosity overcame my fear, and I started to walk down the steps. With each step, the murmur became clearer, like a melody sung by overlapping voices, but in a language I had never heard. When I finally reached the end of the ladder, a metal door separated me from whatever was going on there. The sound on the other side was mesmerizing and at the same time terrifying. With a tremendous hand, I turned the metal door handle, which opened with a prolonged creaking. What I saw on the other side made my heart cold. The room was lit by candles arranged in precise circles, casting grotesque shadows on the stone walls. In the center, there was a large stone table, stained with something that seemed to be dried blood. On the back of the table, hooded figures were kneeling, mumbling in unison. The sound was almost hypnotic, but the words were indecipherable, guttural, as if they were not made to be understood. Despite the heat of the candles, the air was cold, loaded with a metallic smell and an acre that could only be blood. I hid behind a pile of boxes piled near the entrance, trying to control my breath and understand what I was selling. Whatever it was, it didn't seem to be a simple religious ritual. As I watched, I noticed something even more disturbing. The hooded figures, however, move in sync, but not like normal people. Their movements were strangely rigid, as if manipulated by invisible wires. Then a sound cut off the murmur, something like a muffled but clearly human scream from somewhere behind the room. The figures stopped mumbling at once, as if they were one entity and must move towards the sound. My heart popped, and I knew I had to get out of there before I found myself. But while I was trying to recover in silence, my flashlight, which was in my pocket, fell on the ground with a dry thump. The sound echoed through the room, and all the figures turned towards me at the same time. Even without seeing their faces, I could feel that they were looking at me. As I tried to process what I was seeing, I heard something that made my heart almost stop. It was a sound of footsteps coming from the corridor where I had entered. It was not hasty steps, but firm and deliberate, as if someone were walking with a purpose. I froze in place, holding the flashlight with enough force to make my fingers hurt. I called, half stammering, asking if there was anyone there. My voice echoed in the hall, but no one answered. The steps stopped suddenly, and everything became absurdly quiet, as if the sound had been sucked out of the environment. Then came a whisper. It was low, almost inaudible, but seemed to come from all sides at once. It wasn't in English. It wasn't in any language I knew. It seemed something guttural, almost animal, but with a cadence that suggested words. The buzzing from before came back, but now it seemed to mix with the whisper, creating a kind of vibration that I could feel in my chest. At that moment, I decided I had crossed the line. I started to move towards the exit, trying not to make any noise. But before I could reach the door, something happened that made me question everything. The old golden plates that were on the floor of the hall, I had noticed some scattered like pieces of fallen decoration, began to shine very lightly, as if an internal light was lighting in them. At the same time, I felt a pressure in the air, as if the environment was closing around me. The brightness became more intense, and then I saw something that still gives me chills to remember. What looked like blood began to flow from the edges of these plates, slowly, as if it was emerging from the metal itself. The blood formed lines that ran to the center of the circle on the ground, joining the melted wax. It couldn't be real, but I was seeing and smelling the metallic smell of fresh blood. I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed, as if something was holding me in place. The paralysis was abruptly broken when a loud, dry sound, like a door slamming, echoed through the temple. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but it seemed like the noise wasn't coming from a specific place. It was just everywhere. Instinctively, I turned to the entrance, but it was completely dark, as if the moonlight that illuminated the outside had disappeared. My heart was beating so hard that I could hear it in my ears, and the buzzing, now more intense, seemed to vibrate in my bones. It was then that I realized I was no longer alone. At the edge of the circle of symbols, there was a shadow. It wasn't a person, it was something. Tall and slender, with contours that seemed to flicker like the smoke of a blown candle. No face, but even so I knew he was looking directly at me. Without thinking, I pointed the lantern at the thing, but the light seemed to be swallowed by its outline. It did not illuminate, just disappeared as if absorbed. I felt an unbearable pressure in my head, as if something was trying to enter my mind, searching my thoughts. My instinct was to get out of there, but my feet seemed stuck on the ground, as if the air around me had solidified. It was then that the shadow began to move. Slowly, almost as if floating, it crossed the circle and stopped a few meters from me. The only thing I could do was to close my eyes and pray that it would end. I didn't know what to believe, but at that moment, everything worked. After a few seconds that seemed like hours, the sound stopped. When I opened my eyes, the hall was empty. The shadow had disappeared, and the blood on the golden plates too. But the smell was still there, and the feeling that something had touched me in a way I could never understand. Still in shock, I started walking towards the exit. My legs trembled and my heart beat. Each step seemed a monumental effort, and the silence of the temple was even more suffocating than before. The only thing I could hear was the irregular sound of my own breathing. When I finally got to the door, something stopped me. There were marks on the inside, like deep scratches that weren't there when I walked in. Don't know why, but I approached to touch one of the marks, and the wall was absurdly cold, as if it had been left in a freezer for days. It was different from the rest of the temple, which had that muffled heat. I took my hand quickly, with an almost primal instinct that I should not touch it. But when I looked at my hand, there was a dark spot, almost black. No blood. It wasn't dust. It was something that didn't make sense, and honestly I didn't want to find out what it was. I got out of there as fast as I could. I didn't look back as I walked down the road to the truck, but the feeling of being watched never disappeared. When I got to the vehicle, my hands were shaking so much that it took me a few minutes to put the key in the ignition. As soon as the engine started, I accelerated as fast as possible to get out of that place. The relief was short-lived. As I drove down the deserted road, I saw something in my corner of the eye. In the rearview mirror, for a fraction of a second, I swear that I saw the same shadow, standing in the middle of the road, as if he was watching me go away. Didn't look again. Didn't want to confirm. I just kept driving, and didn't stop until I got back to the city. When I finally arrived at the small motel where I was staying, I locked the door, closed the curtains, and sat on the floor, trying to understand what had happened. But the more I thought, the less sense it made. After that night, I decided not to tell anyone what had happened. Ethan asked me casually the next day if I had had the courage to go to the temple, but I lied, saying that I was not even close. He laughed and commented something about better this way. During the following days, I became paranoid. Any noise in the motel made me jump, and the feeling of being watched continued. I didn't see the shadow anymore, but I never felt completely alone either. Before leaving the city, I decided to take a last drive around the streets, trying to convince myself that what happened was the fruit of my imagination. It was then that I saw something that made me speed back to the highway without looking back. In the community mural of the city, where they used to put notices and local events, there was a newly clipped brochure. It was an invitation to a special meeting in the temple. No details, just the date and a small print phrase, "Come and get what has been promised." The date was that same night. Even now, months later, when I try to put my thoughts in order, nothing makes sense. I researched the temple, the city, anything that could give me an explanation, but all I found were vague stories and local legends. There are no official records that anything strange happened there, but neither is there any mention of what the temple was before it was abandoned. Ethan or anyone else in town never answered me. They seem to have disappeared. Since I came back, I still dream about it. The hall, the symbols, the blood, and the shadow. Always the shadow. I don't tell them because I want someone to believe me. I'm telling you because I don't want to carry it myself. I know some people will laugh, say it's an invention or exaggeration. That's fine. I just need someone to know because, until today, I feel that it is not over. And if you ever pass through that city, please do not go up to the temple. The secret group. I have never been one to believe in conspiracies or secret society stories, but after what I've lived through, I can't look at it the same way anymore. It all started when I was researching the stories of dissent within known religions. I am an investigative journalist, and from time to time, I receive clues that seem absurd at first glance, but end up revealing something bigger. One of these tracks arrived by email, anonymously, with a short message and an attached file. The message said, "If you want the truth, follow it, but be prepared for the consequences." The file contained translated excerpts from something that looked like an ancient text, mentioning a dark prophet and practices that included blood sacrifices. Initially, I thought it was just a joke, but references to specific locations like an isolated Mormon community in an outback state caught my attention. It was not the kind of story I could ignore. With some connections and a little research, I found that such a community really existed and had a peculiar confidence. Although it was officially part of the Mormon Church, some people claimed that the group had its own costumes, more closed and less orthodox. I decided to travel there. It was an open day when I arrived. The city seemed calm, almost monotonous. Everything was organized, clean, and the people they saw walking through the streets were calmly friendly at first sight. But there was something in their eyes, as if I knew that I was not from there and was analyzing every move of mine. After staying in a simple motel at the entrance of the city, I started to explore. It didn't take me long to realize that there were issues that the locals avoided discussing. When he asked about the dark prophet in a shop, the clerk just laughed nervously and said, "I haven't heard that name in years. You should forget it." It was enough to awaken my instinct as a reporter. That night, I decided to go for a walk, trying to capture anything that could lead me to some clue. The city seemed deserted after sunset, as if everyone had simply disappeared. The only light came from the spaced poles and windows of some houses. As I walked down the main street, I heard something strange coming from a direction that I could not identify immediately. It was a low sound, like a distant but continuous murmur. The sound followed, which took me to a more isolated area of the city, where the houses were more spacious and there was less lighting. It was there that I saw a building that stood out, a kind of warehouse surrounded by an old wooden fence. There were no lights on, but the sound seemed to come from there. As much as my instinct told me to go back, something pulled me to continue. As I approached, I noticed that the fence was broken at one point, creating a narrow passage. I entered without thinking much, with the heart racing and the feeling that I was being watched. The sound was now clearer, voices in unison, almost like a prayer, but with a disturbing cadence. The door of the warehouse was half open, and from the crack I could see a weak light oscillating inside, probably candles. I took a deep breath and pushed the door slowly, trying not to make any noise, which paralyzed me. Inside the warehouse, a group of people was gathered around a long stone table, where something was covered by a dark cloth. They wore simple clothes, but there was something in the way of moving, rigid, almost rehearsed, that made me freeze. And then I saw what caught my attention, a man in the center, different from the others, who seemed connected to everything. He said nothing, but everyone looked at him as if they were waiting for some kind of command. My instinct was to get out of there as soon as possible, but my legs didn't obey. The scene was so surreal that it seemed to hold my body in place. I watched as the man in the center, who I assumed to be the dark prophet, slowly picked up an old and battered book. He opened the book carefully, and the group began to chant in a language I did not recognize. The words had a strange rhythm, as if they were not meant to be said by human voices. The air inside the warehouse seemed heavier every second, almost as if being consumed by something invisible. It was then that he removed the cloth covering the stone table, revealing a small animal, a lamb, still alive but immobile. My eyes widened when I saw a knife shining in the candlelight. The prophet held his blade high as the group intensified their singing, and my heart almost burst out of my mouth. I knew what was about to happen. I couldn't watch. I turned quickly, trying to get out of the warehouse as quietly as possible, but I bumped into something. A piece of wood did not slip with a loud snap, and the sound echoed through the place. Everything stopped. The singing, the movements, even the air seemed to have been motionless. My whole body froze, and I knew they were listening. I tried to hide behind a pile of boxes in the corner, holding my breath as I heard steady steps approaching. The voices were now whispered, but laden with something that seemed more than anger. It was as if they knew I was there. The sound of the steps stopped on the opposite side of the pile where I was hiding. The silence was unbearable, And then I heard the voice of the prophet, calm but deep. "We have a visitor." My blood froze. He knew exactly where I was. At that moment, I knew I couldn't stand still. My only chance was to run and hope they weren't fast enough to catch me. I got up from where it was hiding and ran in the opposite direction, knocking down some boxes in the process. I heard screams and hasty steps behind me, but did not look back. The door I had entered through was still open, and my only concern was to reach it before they caught me. When I finally crossed the door and went outside, I felt the cold night air hit my face, but did not stop. I ran towards the broken fence, jumping over it and almost falling across. My heart was racing, and my vision seemed clouded by the adrenaline, but I kept running down the deserted road toward the motel. Even as the distance between me and the warehouse increased, I could still hear something, not steps, but voices. They were singing again, but now there was something else. It was as if those voices were in my head. I arrived at the motel panting, my legs shaking so much that I could barely open the door of my room. As soon as I entered, I locked everything and threw myself on the floor, trying to catch my breath. My whole body hurt, but the fear did not let me think of anything other than what I had just witnessed. I took my phone to call the police, but something made me hesitate. How would I explain this? That I witnessed a hooded group, led by a dark prophet, performing rituals with strange chants? No one would believe it. As I thought about what to do, I heard a noise coming from outside. Someone was walking down the motel corridor. I stood up slowly and looked through the door's peephole. The corridor seemed empty, but I was sure I heard footsteps. As exhausted as I was, I spent the whole night sitting on the floor, leaning against the door, without courage to close my eyes. When the sun finally rose, I gathered my things and left the motel as fast as I could. The city looked different in daylight, more quiet, almost welcoming, but I knew that was just a facade. Drive without stopping until I was miles away, but the feeling of being observed did not leave me. As much as I tried, I could not get the warehouse scene out of my head, the songs, and especially the voice of the prophet, which still seems to echo in my mind. When I got home, I locked myself in the apartment and tried to organize my thoughts. I reviewed the notes I had made before the trip and noticed something that I had ignored. The anonymous email mentioned that once seen, the cycle closes. At the time, I did not pay much attention, but now these words seemed a dark warning, as if something had been activated when I witnessed that ritual. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen. Small noises in the apartment, like steps in the corridor at night, and shadows that seemed to move through the corner of the vision. My sleep became increasingly difficult, and when I finally could sleep, I was always plagued by nightmares. In one of them, I was back at the warehouse, surrounded by the hooded figures, and the prophet whispered something that I could not understand. When I woke up, there were scratches on the wall near my bed. I don't know if they were made by me in a moment of panic or for something else. Since then, I have avoided talking about what happened. I have not told anyone, nor written anything other than this report. All I know is that if you get a clue like the one I got, or hear about a closed community with a dark prophet, do what I didn't. Stay away. Some truths are simply not worth discovering. The rituals of blood. I never imagined that a simple trip to photograph landscapes would take me to something that keeps me from sleeping until today. I've always been passionate about photography and used to drive to remote places in search of unique scenery. At that time, I had heard of a mountainous region which was especially beautiful during the equinox, with sunlight perfectly aligned between two mountains. It was not a very visited place, but this only increased my interest. I arrived in the nearest town a day before, a tiny village that seemed to be standing still in time. Everything was too quiet, almost uncomfortable, and the locals looked at me as if I was the first stranger they saw in years. I used to ignore these things, but something about the way people whispered with each other made me uneasy. A lady in the market asked me if I was there to the altar. When I asked her what she meant, she just shook her head and muttered something I didn't understand. That night, I stayed in a simple and almost empty inn. During dinner, I heard more about the altar. One of the few guests, an older and visibly nervous man, commented that the place was used for strange things during equinoxes. He did not go into details, but made it clear that no one from the region approached the area after dark. I should have heard the warning, but something in me could not ignore it. The next morning, I went out with my equipment and headed for the mountains. The walk was long, but the landscape was so beautiful that the strangeness of the city almost disappeared from my mind. When I reached the top, I found this altar, a huge smooth stone in the center of a clearing, covered with inscriptions that seemed to be engraved centuries ago. It was impressive and at the same time disturbing. The air there looked different, heavier, as if the place were loaded with something invisible. I spent a lot of time photographing the altar and the surroundings, trying to capture the special light that hit the mountains. But as the sun began to set, a feeling of discomfort took hold of me. The silence at the top of that clearing was almost absolute, interrupted only by the occasional sound of wind. It was then that I noticed something I had not noticed before: dry marks around the altar, like dark spots on the earth. It was not just dirt or shadows. As we got closer, it became clear that it was dry blood. My stomach turned. Who would have done that there? And why? As I looked closer, I heard a sound that made me freeze in place. It was low, almost like a murmur, coming from far away. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind passing through the trees, but the sound was very rhythmic, as if it were some kind of song. I thought about leaving at that moment, but curiosity overcame me. Took my camera and followed the sound, which seemed to come from a trail that went down behind the altar. The path was narrow, surrounded by dense trees that blocked the sunlight, making everything even darker. As I approached, the sound became clearer. It was definitely a song in a language I did not recognize. There was something strange about the melody. It was mesmerizing, but also disturbing. When I finally reached the end of the track, what I saw left me breathless. The clearing below was lit by torches, and about a dozen people, all dressed in dark robes, were gathered around another altar, smaller and even more detailed than what I had seen before. They held cups in their hands, which shone in the light of torches, while continuing the song that seemed to echo through the whole forest. My instinct was to leave immediately, but I was paralyzed. Each movement of them seemed calculated, as part of an ancient ritual that no one should be seeing. I watched as one of the hooded men approached the central altar, carrying something that seemed to move. My heart froze when I realized it was an animal, a small goat, tied up and clearly terrified. The group intensified the chanting as the figure placed the animal on the altar, and then something I will never forget happened. The hooded man raised a bright knife, and in a quick movement, cut the throat of the animal. The blood gushed out of the stone, running down grooves in the altar that seemed to lead him to the bowls in the hands of the other members. The clearing was taken by a heavy silence, interrupted only by the sound of blood dripping. It was not just macabre, it was something I knew deep down that I should not be witnessing. As I tried to slowly move away, with my heart pounding, something went wrong. I stepped on a dry branch, which broke with a loud enough snap to cut the silence like a knife. The whole group stopped and turned towards me at the same time. Even in the dark, I could feel their eyes were stuck on me, as if they could see through the trees. A larger figure, who seemed to lead the group, stepped forward and raised his hand. Don't know if it was a command or a warning, but it was enough to get me out of trance. Swiveled my heels and ran as fast as I could back down the trail. The sound of the chant started again behind me, but now it was different, louder, more aggressive, and seemed to follow me through the forest. I knew I had to get out of there before they caught up with me. The trail seemed much longer on the way back, as if the forest was closing around me. The trees, before only shadows in my field of vision, now seemed to move with the singing echoing between them. I didn't know if I was imagining things or really hearing steps behind me, but fear drove me to run faster. My legs were tired, and every breath seemed to shave my throat, but I could not stop. When I finally saw the big altar, the first one I photographed, I felt a brief relief, but it lasted only for a short time. The sound of the songs was still there, now so loud that it seemed to be all around me. There was no one visible, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I took my camera that I had left near the altar, and it was then that I noticed something strange. The inscriptions on the stone seemed brighter than before, as if they were reflecting some light that I could not see. Without thinking twice, I headed toward the way back to the parking lot where my car was. My legs almost gave in with relief when I saw the open clearing where I had left the car. But as soon as I got in the vehicle and locked the doors, I heard something that made me freeze. Across the road, among the trees, a hooded figure stood. I was not moving at all, just staring at me. You couldn't see his face, but there was something in his posture that told me it wasn't one of the same ones I had seen before. It was bigger, more intimidating, and seemed to wait for something. I turned on the engine, but my hands trembled so much that it took me a while to get the car moving. When I finally left, I sped up as fast as I could without looking back. Still, while driving down the deserted road, I could not get rid of the feeling that this figure was still watching me somehow. After driving for almost an hour without stopping, I finally started to feel the adrenaline go down. But the fear was still there, like a shadow I couldn't get away from. I stopped the car at a gas station in the middle of nowhere to try to catch my breath and organize my thoughts. As I filled the tank, I noticed that my hands were still shaking, and the sound of singing was echoing in my head, as if it had been recorded there. When I went to the convenience store to buy water, the attendant looked at me in a strange way, as if he realized that something was wrong with me. He said nothing, but before I left, he commented softly, "You were in the mountains, weren't you? Don't come back." It gave me a shiver. I hadn't mentioned anything to him, but somehow he knew. I pretended not to listen and got back to the car as fast as I could. When I got home, I thought the worst was over, but that's when things started to get even stranger. That night, I had terrible nightmares. I saw myself back in the forest, surrounded by those hooded figures, but now they were closer, as if they knew that I was there. I woke up sweating, with the sound of the songs still echoing in my ears, as if they had never really stopped. I got up from bed to drink water and noticed something that made me freeze. My boots, which were in the corner of the room, were covered with mud and dry leaves. I had cleaned everything before entering the house, so how was that possible? I went to the window and looked at the street. It was all dark, but for a brief moment, I swear I saw a silhouette standing on the sidewalk still. I blinked, and it disappeared. I closed the curtains and stayed up for the rest of the night, hoping that it was just my imagination. In the following days, things got even more disturbing. I tried to follow my routine, but something was wrong. I started hearing strange sounds around the house at night, light steps, as if someone was walking through the rooms, and low whispers that stopped as soon as I tried to pay attention. More than once, I woke up with the feeling that there was someone in the room with me, but when I turned on the light, everything was empty. The images of the altar and ritual kept coming back to my mind, torturing me with every moment of silence. I decided to review the photos I took that day, thinking maybe I could find some clue, something that would help me understand what was happening. When I connected the camera to my computer and opened the files, I felt a cold shiver running through my spine. All the photos I took from the altar were there, but there was something else. In the background of some images, among the trees, you could see shadows that were not there before. Hooded silhouettes, immobile, as if they were watching me. I shut down the computer immediately, but the fear was already in me. I didn't know what to do. Thinking about erasing the photos seemed like the right thing to do, but a part of me felt that it wouldn't change anything. That night, something happened that confirmed my worst fears. I woke up in the early morning with a sound coming from the room. It was a low snap, followed by a drag, as if something heavy were being moved. Took a lantern and walked slowly to the corridor, with my heart pounding. When I reached the room, I saw the front door ajar. My instinct was to check if there was anyone out there, but as soon as I opened the door completely, I saw something I will never forget. On the ground, in the center of the sidewalk, was a mark drawn with what seemed to be blood. It was the same symbol that was on the altar of the clearing. I looked around, but the street was empty. I closed the door, locked all the locks, and spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor, trying to convince myself that it was just a coincidence. The next morning, I decided that I could not continue to ignore what was happening. Took the photos, deleted all from the memory card, and deleted the files from the computer. But even after doing that, the feeling that something was still with me didn't go away. During the day, everything seemed relatively normal, but at night, the atmosphere in my house changed completely. The shadows seemed to move in the corners of my room, and the sounds of footsteps continued, always stopping when I tried to check. One night, as I was looking out the window, I saw something that made my heart almost stop. Across the street, a hooded figure stood, just like the one I saw in the forest. She did not move, did not try to hide, just stood there motionless, as if she was watching me. After a few minutes, she disappeared into the darkness without making any sound. To this day, I don't know if what happened was the result of my curiosity or if I ended up crossing with something that I should never have seen. Since that day, I have moved home and try to avoid anything that reminds me of that experience, but nightmares still come, almost always at the equinoxes. Whenever I wake up, I feel like something is present, as if I am still attached to that ritual in some way. I never came back to that region, and I hope no one has to go through what I went through. If you hear stories about ancient rituals and altars in isolated clearings, please don't go. Some truths are not to be discovered, and some experiences have no return. I tried to forget, but I know that it is still out there. And sometimes I have the feeling that it is waiting for me. I looked around, but the street was empty. I closed the door, locked all the locks, and spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor, trying to convince myself that it was just a coincidence. The next morning, I decided that I could not continue to ignore what was happening. Took the photos, deleted all from the memory card, and deleted the files from the computer. But even after doing that, the feeling that something was still with me didn't go away. During the day, everything seemed relatively normal, but at night, the atmosphere in my house changed completely. The shadows seemed to move in the corners of my room, and the sounds of footsteps continued, always stopping when I tried to check. One night, as I was looking out the window, I saw something that made my heart almost stop. Across the street, a hooded figure stood, just like the one I saw in the forest. She did not move, did not try to hide, just stood there motionless, as if she was watching me. After a few minutes, she disappeared into the darkness without making any sound. To this day, I don't know if what happened was the result of my curiosity or if I ended up crossing with something that I should never have seen. Since that day, I have moved home and try to avoid anything that reminds me of that experience, but nightmares still come, almost always at the equinoxes. Whenever I wake up, I feel like something is present, as if I am still attached to that ritual in some way. I never came back to that region, and I hope no one has to go through what I went through. If you hear stories about ancient rituals and altars in isolated clearings, please don't go. Some truths are not to be discovered, and some experiences have no return. I tried to forget, but I know that it is still out there. And sometimes I have the feeling that it is waiting for me. The silenced, call to sacrifice. I had heard of the city before, you know. It was the kind of place that people mentioned with a strange tone in their voice, as if they didn't want to say much. My editor had sent me to investigate some cases of disappearances and some strange rumors about a local group. Nothing too much, just small-town mysteries," as he said. But since I stepped there, everything seemed wrong. It was as if the air was heavier, people avoided eye contact, and no one wanted to answer simple questions. It seemed that everyone knew something I didn't know, and were too terrified to talk about. But the worst started at night, when I returned to the hotel. I was going through my notes in the room, trying to put the pieces together. He had interviewed some residents, but it was like trying to draw blood from a stone. No one wanted to compromise. Then I saw something through the window. Outside, near the edge of the forest, there was a man standing, just looking towards my room. He was too far away for me to see his face, but there was something wrong with his posture, as if his body did not move naturally. He was there for a good 5 minutes, doing nothing. When I finally created the courage to take a camera and take a picture, he was no longer there. That night, I had the worst nightmare I can remember. I was in the middle of the forest, surrounded by hooded figures. They were singing something in a language I had never heard before, but that somehow seemed to get right into my head. I couldn't move, as if my feet were stuck on the ground, and the sound was getting louder, more suffocating. When one of the figures came up and lowered his hood, it was my face that was there. I woke up with a jump, sweating, and with the feeling that it was not just a dream. I looked at the clock at 3:33 a.m. I always hated that time. The next day, I went out to continue investigating, but it seemed that something had changed. People looked at me as if they knew my nightmare, as if they knew what was happening to me. A gentleman in the square stopped me, without even asking anything, and said, "Go while you can. They already know about you." Before I could answer, he turned his back and left in a hurry, looking sideways as if being followed. What made me more uneasy was that I didn't know who they were, but somehow I knew he was right. At the end of that afternoon, I decided to go into the forest where the man had appeared the night before. It wasn't my initial plan, but it felt like something was pulling me there, like an itching in the mind that I couldn't ignore. I walked with my recorder in hand, writing down everything I saw: strange marks on the trees, trails that seemed to be used regularly but not by animals. There was a heavy silence inside, as if the whole forest were holding their breath. It was when I stumbled on something, a small cloth bag tied with a leather cord. I opened it, and inside there were human teeth and a piece of paper with my name written in a handwriting that I did not recognize. I got out of there as fast as I could, trying to pretend that it didn't happen. When I got back to the hotel, my head was in a million, but what was waiting for me in the room made my blood cold. Someone had been there. My laptop was on, with a video paused on the screen. When I pressed play, it was a recording of me sleeping, only that it was not a night I remember. In the video, there were shadows moving around me, as if someone or something was at the foot of the bed watching. I turned off my laptop and sat down, shaking, with the feeling that I was no longer alone in the room. I couldn't sleep that night. I spent hours sitting in bed, staring at every corner of the room, trying to convince myself that it was just a bad joke. But as much as I tried to rationalize, a feeling of being watched did not leave me alone. At 3:33 a.m., the phone rang. Answered with a trembling hand, but no one said anything. All I heard was that nightmare song, low, distant, but unmistakable. Hung up right away, but the sound seemed to have stuck in my head. I took my things and decided that I was going to leave that city at dawn. It did not matter if the matter would be incomplete. My intuition cried that I needed to get out of there. When the sun finally rose, I got into the car and started driving, but something was wrong. The road seemed to repeat itself, as if I was stuck in a loop. I passed the same fallen tree 3 times, the same abandoned gas station, until I realized that my compass did not make sense. I decided to stop and look at the map, but when I got out of the car, silence swallowed me up. There were no birds, no wind. It was as if the whole world had paused. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't come right away, but I knew I wasn't alone. That same corner of the phone was now coming from close, as if it were being whispered in my ear. I turned slowly, and what I saw made my legs almost give out. He was the man I had seen on the first night, standing there by the roadside with the same eyes fixed and empty. Only now he was not alone. Other figures began to emerge from the forest, one by one, all with the same strange posture, as if their bodies were manipulated by invisible wires. They did not speak, but their lips moved, forming the words of that song that seemed to pierce my head. I wanted to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground. The man stepped forward and raised his hand, pointing directly at me. It was at this moment that something took over my body, a primitive fear, almost paralyzing. Somehow I managed to get back into the car and start all over. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I was afraid of what I could see. The road finally started to change, and I began to recognize the landmarks that indicated I was leaving town. But even from a distance, the singing didn't stop. I felt like it had been recorded in my mind. When I got home, I tried to erase everything from memory, but things did not return to normal. People I met in the city started to show up in nightmares. Worse, I received a letter in the mail days later. Inside, a piece of paper with those same words that were in the corner and a warning. You saw too much. After receiving that letter, I began to notice strange things around me. Objects in the house moved, shadows appeared where there should be nothing, and the feeling of being observed never disappeared. One night, I woke up with the feeling that there was someone in the room. When I looked, I saw a figure standing in the corner, still but clearly watching me. Lit the light in a panic, and there was no one there. That's when I noticed something in the mirror. My reflection was different, almost misplaced. He did not move exactly like me, with a subtle but terrifying delay. That was the last straw. I decided to drop everything, my research, my career, even my apartment. I left town and erased any record of the story, but even then I could not escape completely. To this day, I feel that they are still watching me. Sometimes I wake up at 3:33 in the morning with that melody echoing in my mind, and each time, it seems more difficult to remember exactly what happened in the city. My name in the letter was not the only thing that bothered me. It was as if that were a warning that, even outside the city, I still belonged to something greater, something I never wanted to be part of. What about the truth? Don't know how long I have before they come for me once and for all. The chosen lamb. When I took this job, I confess that I was more excited than I should have been. It's not often that a journalist has the chance to investigate something as obscure and rumored as the supposed secret rituals of this forgotten little town on the map. I thought it would be one of those exaggerated stories from the interior, you know. But the first thing I noticed when I arrived was the heavy weather. People avoided talking to me or giving vague answers, as if they were afraid of something. It seemed like no one wanted to help me find out what was really going on there. And honestly, after all, I don't blame them either. Everything started to go wrong when I found an old document in the local library. It was a dusty manuscript, hidden in the bottom of an archive that seemed to be untouched for decades. He described rituals that involved human sacrifices to open a sacred portal to the so-called hidden heavenly kingdom. At first, I thought it was some piece of fiction written by a resident with a fertile imagination, but the descriptions were too detailed. Each ritual had specific rules, and the last one, called the Red Lamb Offering, mentioned that the chosen would be someone pure of heart, completely alien to their own destiny. The part that froze me most was to read that when the lamb is marked, he will feel the call without ever understanding why. After reading that document, I felt as if something had changed in the room. I can't explain it, but it was like the air was denser, heavier. I put the manuscript in my backpack and left the library in a hurry, but the feeling accompanied me to the hotel. I spent the rest of the day trying to understand what I had read, searching for any mention of such hidden heavenly kingdom on the internet. Nothing. It seemed that document was the only source on this. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I felt restless, as if being watched, but the worst part came at dawn. About 3 a.m, I woke up with a strange feeling, as if someone had touched my shoulder. The room was completely dark, but I had a clear impression of hearing whispers, very low, like a prayer in a language that I did not recognize. The next day, I decided to go out and explore the city and try to get it out of my head. But things just got stranger. I noticed some people's sneaky looks, as if they knew something I didn't know. At one point, as I passed the main square, an older woman stared at me. It wasn't the normal kind of look. She seemed to be evaluating me, almost as if she was deciding something. When I got close, she just whispered something I couldn't understand and moved away fast. That's when I started to connect the dots. The document said that the lamb would be marked, but it did not explain how. That woman, that look, did she know anything? From that moment on, I began to notice things that before seemed insignificant, but now made my heart speed. In the places I visited, people seemed to whisper to each other after I passed. Some looked at me with a strange expression, as if they were surprised or sorry. At first, I thought it was paranoia, but the frequency of these looks and murmurs increased every hour. In the afternoon, I decided to go back to the hotel and take another look at the manuscript. That's when I noticed something disturbing. On the last page, there was a drawing I had not noticed before, a circle with strange symbols, and in the center, a humanoid figure surrounded by flames. The worst? That figure seemed to be looking directly at me. It was not possible. I was sure that drawing wasn't there when I first read it. As I tried to understand what was happening, I heard a noise coming from the hotel corridor. It was as if someone was dragging something heavy, but when I opened the door there was no one. All I found was a mark on the carpet, as if something had been pushed to stop in front of my room. In the middle of the mark, there was a small red flower, which looked freshly harvested. I remembered the words of the manuscript about the lamb being marked, and a shiver ran through my spine. It couldn't be a coincidence. Something or someone was trying to tell me that I was the chosen one. At that time, I did not know if I would stay in the room or if I would take my things and get out of town. But as much as fear told me to go away, something was holding me there. It was as if a part of me needed to know what was happening, even if that meant diving deeper into this nightmare. I took the flower and put it in my pocket without knowing why, and went down to the reception to try to find out who had passed through the corridor. The receptionist, a young woman who seemed bored until then, turned pale when I asked her a question. She denied that any guest or employee had been on my floor at the time. When I mentioned the flower, she avoided looking at me and said only, "You should go while you still can." I decided to ignore her warning and went to a nearby cafe to try to organize my thoughts. There, I realized that my name was in one of the headlines of a local newspaper, something about a stranger in town asking inconvenient questions. It was at this moment that a man I had never seen before sat at my table without asking. He was dressed in simple fashion, but his eyes had something that made me uncomfortable. He leaned over to me and said, "You need to understand that some truths are not for everyone, and when you are the chosen one, there is no escape." Before I could react, he got up and left, as if nothing had happened. When I went after him, he just disappeared in the street. After that, I returned to the hotel with the feeling that every step was being monitored. Closed the curtains, locked the door, and sat on the bed, trying to convince myself that all this was the result of a growing nervousness, or worse, of coincidences exaggerated by my mind. But any hope of normality was destroyed that very night. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, I woke up to a noise in my room. It was the sound of slow, almost calculated steps coming from within. My heart shot, but when I looked around, there was no one. The only thing out of place was the manuscript, which was now open on a page I did not remember seeing. In it, there was only one phrase written: "The lamb does not choose sacrifice. The sacrifice chooses the lamb." How long I stood there, staring at those words, but a shiver came up my spine when I saw a shadow moving along the wall, even without any apparent light source. It was tall, disproportionate, as if it did not belong to something human. I tried to speak, but my throat seemed to be blocked. Suddenly, the shadow approached the manuscript, and the pages began to turn on their own, until they stopped in an illustration that looked like a replica of the symbol I had seen before. Only now, in the center of the drawing, there was something new: my face. It was not like me, it was exactly my face, drawn with a precision that made no sense. It was at that moment I realized that it wasn't just a warning. It was a sentence. The fear consumed me, but there was still a part of me that tried to rationalize, find a logical explanation. Took the manuscript and, without looking directly at the page with the drawing, threw it into my backpack. I decided that I needed to leave that hotel immediately. As I was going down the stairs, I felt a strange sensation, as if the air around me was too heavy, suffocating. I got to the lobby and saw the receptionist again. She stared at me for a moment and, before I could say anything, just shook her head negatively, as if telling me it was too late. I decided not to insist and went out the front door, feeling her eyes following me until I disappeared in the darkness of the street. As I walked through the deserted streets, the feeling of being followed was overwhelming. There was no noise, no sound of steps, but something inside me screamed that I wasn't alone. When I got to the car, I felt a momentary relief as I unlocked the door and walked in. But as I turned on the headlights, my heart froze. There, a few meters away, was the same figure I had seen in the hotel corridor. Still immobile, but with a presence that seemed to fill the whole space. Their eyes, or whatever they were, shone in a way I had never seen before, as if they were crossing me. I snatched up and sped, looking away, but still I felt that it kept watching me no matter how fast I was. While driving, I began to realize that the city streets no longer made sense. I passed through the same places repeatedly, even going in different directions. The clock on the panel was 3:33, and it seemed frozen at that time. No matter how long I drove, that hour did not pass. I began to feel an unbearable pressure in my chest, as if something invisible was compressing me. Looking in the rear-view mirror, I had the impression that the figure was still there, but closer than before, even if I had not heard or seen anything move. When I finally gathered courage to stop the car and leave, the air outside seemed unreal, heavy, as if I was breathing through a veil. It was then that I saw something on the ground, right in front of me, the same symbol of the manuscript, drawn with perfection on the asphalt, as if it were waiting for me. The circle shone slightly, but there was no source of light nearby. Before I could react, I started to hear that song again, which already seemed to echo inside my mind. Only this time it was different. It was loud, clear, and came from all sides. I felt my body being pulled to the center of the symbol, without being able to move or resist. The sound was getting louder, more deafening, until suddenly everything stopped. The silence was so absolute that I only realized I was standing again when I opened my eyes and realized I was no longer on the road. When I opened my eyes, I was in a place I could not recognize. It was no longer the road or any place in the city that I had seen before. The environment was dark, but not like an ordinary night. It seemed that darkness had weight, as if it could swallow me at any moment. There was a faint red light that pulsed in the distance, almost like a beating heart. I tried to move, but my body was strange, as if it were heavier or trapped by something invisible. Looking around, I realized that I was not alone. Capped figures surrounded the space, forming a perfect circle around me. They did not move or make noise, but I knew that they were there for me. It was then that I realized something even more disturbing. In the center of the circle, There was a stone altar with dark spots that I didn't need to look at closely to know what they were. At the top of the altar, there was a small statue that seemed to observe me. Even without eyes, the feeling of being analyzed was almost unbearable. The figures began to move slowly, as if following a rhythm that only they could hear. It was at that moment that I heard a voice, but it wasn't coming from any of the figures. It was a voice inside my head, cold and impersonal, saying only, "The lamb is ready. The offer will be accepted." The voice inside my head seemed to control everything. I could not react nor scream. It was as if my mind were stuck, but at the same time, I could feel every moment, every second of that horror. The hooded figures began to sing the same song I had heard before, only now it was deafening. It seemed to vibrate inside my body, as if it was going to tear me apart from the inside. Suddenly, the red light was throbbing stronger, illuminating the altar, and I saw something that froze me to the bones. At the base of the statue, my own name was engraved, accompanied by symbols that looked archaic. It was as if I had been part of that ritual from the beginning, without ever knowing. In a blink of an eye, everything changed. The light went out, the singing ceased, and the figures disappeared. I was back in the car, on the same road where it all started, as if nothing had happened. The clock on the dashboard was 3:34, as if a minute had passed since I entered that spiral of terror. But something was different. In the rearview mirror, my reflection looked wrong, out of place, as if it were no longer completely me. I took my backpack to check the manuscript, but it was gone. The only thing left was the red flower, now withered in the passenger seat. Since then, nothing has returned to normal. Sometimes I hear the song again, quietly in the middle of the night, and feel that the story is not over yet. The last ritual. Since I started investigating the disappearances and rumors about rituals in the city, I knew that I was messing with something bigger than it seemed at first sight. But nothing could prepare me for what I discovered in the last 48 hours. Everything started to make sense in a horrible and inevitable way. The evasive interviews, the glances, and even the moments when it seemed to be deliberately ignored. Only now it was no longer just a theory or an uncomfortable feeling. I found the proof. Old photographs, dusty records in public archives, and even scratched notes in the diaries of former residents. All pointed to one thing, the final sacrifice, and everything indicated that I was next. Last night, someone left a package on the door of my hotel room. Inside there was a grotesque mask, made of leather and decorated with symbols that I recognized from the documents about the cult. Together, there was a note written on an aged paper. The words made me feel as if the ground had disappeared. Prophecy cannot be avoided. The lamb must accept his fate. It was obvious that someone knew exactly what I was investigating and wanted to make clear that there was no way out. I spent the rest of the night awake, alternating between panic and trying to come up with a plan. Anything that would get me out of this situation. But the feeling that time was running out was unbearable. Earlier today, I decided that I could not stand still. I left the hotel and went straight to the City Hall building, where I had found some of the documents earlier. My idea was to try to find out more about the people involved with the cult, any names, any connections that could help me understand how deep it went. But when I got there, I was greeted with even more suspicious looks than before. The receptionist, who before barely looked up at me, now seemed scared. When I asked about the records of old properties in the city, she hesitated and then disappeared through a door in the back without saying a word. That made me alert. I tried to stay calm and wait, but she didn't come back. After a few minutes, I realized something was wrong. The whole building seemed more empty than usual. I got out of there as fast as I could. As I walked down the streets, I began to notice something that made me freeze. People I crossed did not make eye contact. Some even crossed the street to avoid me. It was as if the whole city knew what was happening, or what was about to happen. That's when I noticed a pattern. On every corner, there was a group of people standing, talking in a low voice, and I was sure they were watching me. When I turned into a side street to cut my way back to the hotel, I found something that made me lose my breath. On the floor, painted with red paint, was the same symbol of the mask that was left in my room, and next to it the same phrase of the note, "Prophecy cannot be avoided." I went back to the hotel in panic, trying to understand how that message could be in so many places. My mind was racing, and I knew I couldn't trust anyone. In the bedroom, I closed all the curtains and locked the door with everything I could improvise. Some names were repeated in different records, linked to land, donations, and positions in the city administration. They were people who clearly controlled the local power, and they all had one thing in common. Their families had been in the city for generations. While making these connections, I heard something that made me freeze. Steps in the corridor. They were slow, spaced, but enough to scare me. I got up, went to the door, and looked through the eye. The corridor was empty, but the steps continued, as if echoing directly inside my head. I took my phone to try to call someone, anyone who could help me. But when I looked at the screen, my heart popped. There was a message I did not remember receiving. "You are running, but time is running out." The time of the message was exactly 3:33, and my phone was completely blocked. After reading that message, the last thing I could do was to keep my cool. Everything around me seemed suffocating, as if the room itself was swallowing me. Took the phone again, trying to understand how the message had reached me without a signal, but there was nothing that explained it. I decided that I had to get out of there anyway. Maybe it wasn't the most rational plan, but standing still seemed even worse. Took my things and opened the door slowly, trying not to make noise. The corridor was empty, but there was a strange feeling in the air, something I could not describe. I started walking towards the stairs, and with each step, the feeling of being observed became stronger. When I got downstairs, I realized something was very wrong. The reception was completely empty, but there was a smell in the air, something metallic, almost like blood. I approached the exit door, but before reaching it, I heard a noise behind me. It was the sound of something falling to the ground, heavy, and then absolute silence. I looked over my shoulder and saw something I will never forget. In the middle of the hall on the floor was the mask that had been left in my room, and next to it, painted with paint or something worse, the symbol of the cult. But this time the symbol was different. It had an extra circle around it, as if something had been completed. Seeing that symbol on the ground was like getting punched in the stomach. I couldn't stop looking, but I knew I had to get out of there before something worse happened. I ran to the exit door, but as soon as I touched the handle, I heard footsteps coming from all sides. There was no way to know exactly where they came from, but there were many. Without thinking twice, I went back inside and hid behind the counter of the reception. The sound of the steps increased, as if several people were entering the lobby at the same time. My heart was racing, and my mind could only think one thing: they came for me. Suddenly the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than their sound. I was still trying to control my breath. It was when I heard a low whisper, almost like a wind passing through a tunnel. I didn't understand the words, but the sound was the same song that had haunted me in the last few nights. Slowly, I risked looking over the counter. The lobby was empty, but the mask was no longer on the floor. Before I could react, I felt a cold touch in my neck. I jumped in a fright and turned around, but there was no one there. Only the symbol, now shining slightly, as if it were alive. That light that came out of the symbol seemed to pulsate, as if it had life of its own. Even without understanding, I knew that I should not stay there. My instincts cried that I was in danger, but every time I tried to move, it felt like my body was stuck. It was as if the ground around me had become an invisible swamp, sucking me. Suddenly I heard that song again, but this time louder, as if several voices were singing at the same time. My body began to tremble, and the light of the symbol became so strong that it was impossible to look directly at it. When I closed my eyes, I felt a presence next to me, something that seemed huge, imposing, but I didn't have the courage to face it. It was at that moment the pain began. A strange sensation ran through my chest, as if something was being pulled out of me. It was unbearable. I fell to my knees, trying to scream, but no sound came out of my mouth. It was then that I heard the voice again, the same cold voice that seemed to be inside my mind. Time is up. Sacrifice will be made. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the lobby. I was in a dark room, illuminated only by the dim light of torches hanging on the walls. Around me were capped figures, standing like statues. In the center of the room, I saw a stone altar, and over it, something that seemed ready for me. I could not understand how I had arrived in that place. The altar of stone seemed to call me in a way that I did not know how to explain. The hooded figures around me were silent, but there was a feeling that they were waiting for something, or worse, waiting for me. My legs were shaking, but I could not move, as if my body had been taken by something beyond my control. When I looked at the altar again, I saw the symbol of worship carved in stone, pulsing with that same red light, as if it were a beating heart. It was impossible to look away, and meanwhile that voice returned, stronger, clearer. The chosen one must accept. Suddenly, one of the figures approached. It was the first time any of them moved, and that was enough to make me lose the little control I still had. My heart seemed to explode. The figure bent down and put something in my hands, the mask. I didn't want to touch it, but for some reason my fingers automatically closed around it. The figure spoke for the first time, but his voice seemed to be made of several mixed voices. You cannot escape from fate. The ritual will be complete. Before I could respond or react, I felt my legs move alone toward the altar. It was as if I had been taken over by an invisible force that controls every step. With each step I took towards the altar, my mind cried out to resist, but my body seemed to be in complete disagreement with my will. It was as if I was trapped inside myself, watching everything happen without being able to intervene. The hooded figures began to sing that song again, only now louder, more intense, as if every word was being engraved in my mind. When I arrived at the altar, my arms rose up by themselves, and the mask that I was holding was placed over the symbol carved in the stone. The instant this happened, a strong wind swept through the room, extinguishing all torches, and darkness took hold. In the middle of darkness, I began to hear voices, hundreds of them, as if they were all talking directly to me. They didn't use words, but somehow I understood what they said. The offer will be made. The portal will be opened. It was at that moment that I realized the meaning of what was happening. The sacrifice was not just about me. It was about something much bigger, something that was about to cross into our world. I felt a stabbing pain in my chest, as if something was being forcibly torn out. When I thought it would not hold anymore, everything stopped. The light of the torches returned, and the capped figures disappeared. I was alone, but the altar was still there, with the symbol burned in the stone and the mask now broken in half. The silence that remained in the room was almost as oppressive as the song before. My mind was in chaos, trying to understand what had just happened. I looked at the altar, and although everything was still, there was a sense of something very wrong in the air. I took the broken mask more as a reflection than by choice, and realized that it was now cold like stone. I left the room staggered, feeling my body lighter but empty at the same time. Don't know how long I walked around that place, but eventually I found a way out. When I stepped outside, I realized that I was back in the city, right in the middle of the main square. The church clock marked exactly 3:33. The streets were deserted, but I knew I was not alone. In the days that followed, I tried to understand what happened, but everything seemed a blur. The people of the city acted as if nothing had happened. When I tried to confront some of them, they looked at me with pity, as if I was someone who had lost his mind. I came home, but things were never normal again. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still hear the song, very quietly, coming from somewhere that I cannot locate. And the mask, even broken, remains with me. Every time I think about getting rid of it, something inside me says that I can't. As if somehow all that was not over,